What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making a vintage adding machine. To be honest, this week has been crazy busy and I was contemplating skipping this week's video due to lack of time, but I don't think I've ever missed a YouTube video in over 2 years, which is kind of crazy, and I didn't want this week to be the first. So I decided to quickly jump online and look for something to make. Almost right away I came across this image of an old adding machine, and I thought it looked really interesting. I love the old materials on it, it looked very used and old, and I don't even recall the last vintage model we've made on this channel. So I thought it would be a lot of fun to recreate this one for this week's video. I also found it kind of funny to think how at one point in time this adding machine was probably considered high tech, like top tier technology. People were probably super hyped on it at one point in time. Like literally a really large calculator that can only add. Kind of funny looking back now when we all have these small computers in our pockets that can Google anything in an instant. Crazy how far humans have come. And now jumping ahead over 50 years, we're going to recreate it in our own virtual world. Now, since we don't have any dimensions, we will have to play around with the shapes a little bit to get it to feel right. Luckily, I found some good reference images online, which will really help us when we start texturing it. But figuring out the proportions will be a little bit tricky, and will take a bit of playing around with the shapes to get it to look and feel more accurate to its true size. Now, originally, due to my lack of time, I was planning on making just a single high poly mesh, more along the lines of product design instead of a video game asset. Now, I know people out there will be asking and wanting to see a more optimized model, which could be used in a game engine or something. So after completing the UVs, I quickly removed the bevels and subdivisions to create a lower poly, more optimized model, which you could use as an in-game prop or something like that. And we will go over that later on in the video to show the difference between the two models and compare them to one another. Now, because I had to rush this one a bit, I decided to cut a few corners on some areas of the model, mostly in areas that wouldn't be too viewable to the camera, but we will go over this later on in the video and go over a few things I would do differently if I had to redo it or if I had more time to invest into it. Now, don't forget, like all of my YouTube videos, this video will be available in real time along with all the working files, and you can find it all on my Patreon page, which will be linked in the description below. I'm also going to include the lower poly mesh that I created, so if any of you want some UV practice or just like to recreate your own adding machine, the meshes will be available on there as well. Alright, so like I mentioned, the blockout stage is going to be very important. In every model you make, the blockout stage is always important, but it's going to be extra important because we don't have any measurements or dimensions to work with. So let's take our time to make sure that we have all the main shapes blocked out first before moving on to more interesting and fun things and start adding more details. It's probably going to look pretty bad for a while, but let's not get discouraged. We got to keep pushing through it, and hopefully with time, as we slowly add to it, it will slowly look more like our reference image. Also, for anyone that's following along or recreating this model, if you want to see the reference images that I use while recreating this, you can find it all in the link in the description below. So let's start making this vintage adding machine.
boy, I don't know it, just a bullet for. I done look a boy, I don't I done look a boy, I don't know it, just a bullet for. I done look a boy, I don't
Alright, so here is the adding machine in its finished form. And as you can see, I went ahead and just added some subdivisions and beveled out some edges. Basically just increased the polys to create a more dense mesh. As you can see, if I click on it, this main object, I increased the subdivisions by 2. So it does make it quite dense, but it also allows some really nice smooth curvature around these edges, which is kind of what I was trying to achieve. I was more or less trying to just recreate the reference photo that we were using. I also decided to add 2 pieces of rolled up paper on the side. I just wanted to add something a bit more interesting to the scene, make it a bit more unique. So I just simply took the object we already created and just duplicated it, while also adding a tiny piece of tape to make it look like it actually is keeping it closed. But other than that, everything else is the exact same. Now I did create a second lower poly mesh, and we will go over that in a little bit once I just go over exactly how I prepared this model and how I prepared all of the UVs. So in the very first group and texture is basically the main body shape. And as you can see, if I isolate it, it's basically all the main objects. I just decided to separate all the keys and the paper and some of the smaller objects to another texture set. That way I can just get a bit more resolution out of the numbers that I was going to add into the keys. But to be honest, I probably could have kept it on one texture, but I just decided to split it into 2. And as you can also see, it's quite high in polys. This main object has around 2 subdivisions added to it, and everything else is basically 1. But I just wanted to get some really nice smooth curvature around these edges, since it looked like that in the reference photo, and the main goal of this model was just recreating the reference. Now, one important thing when it came to the UVs was making the cuts on this main body shape. So originally, if you were following the whole UV process, which will be available on my Patreon page, I originally made a cut just along here to separate these 2 shells. And I realized when I jumped into Painter how you can tell that there was a UV cut along these edges. So I had to come back and redo my cuts to make sure that there was basically to hide all of the cuts so it looked seamless and it looked like the real life object. So it was really important to make my cuts along the edges and not directly in front of these faces, the main areas that the camera would be viewing it at. So I didn't want any cuts along the sides or any cuts directly in the front. Now I did add a tiny cut along the edges here, which is technically right in the front, but because it's on an edge and it's on the corner, it really blends it together nicely in Substance Painter, and it kind of looks seamless and you can't really tell that there's actually a cut there. But it was really important to make sure that I didn't have any cuts on the main faces of the object. So in the second group and texture, is basically everything else in the scene. So all the keys, the paper, the little pulley thing on the side, and these tiny little plastic objects. And like I said, the main reason why I separated this was just to get a bit more resolution out of the numbers on my keys, and as well as the paper. I just wanted to have some wrinkles in it, and I thought I could get a bit more resolution out of those final textures, but to be honest with you, I feel like I could have easily combined these and you probably wouldn't have noticed too much of a difference. I also decided to go through and change the rotation of these keys. So if you look at the reference photo, it looks like it's, well, since it's old and vintage and it's been used a lot over the years, the keys are not perfectly straight. You can tell that they're kind of all a little bit loose and angled differently. And I feel like making these small adjustments to your models really helps bring it to life and make it look not so perfect, especially because it's a vintage object. Along with the paper here, so I just did that by using my soft select brush. So by pressing B on my keyboard, you can change the scale, and then I can slightly rotate my paper just to not make it so straight and perfect and give it a little bit more of a realistic look. And of course, it was important to make sure that my UV shells were nice and straight. So for these keys, they're all rotated the same direction. That way none of them are flipped. And it just makes applying the materials and the numbers a lot easier. Along with the paper and really all the shells. Not only does it just save you space on your UV map for more UV shells, but it makes applying materials a lot easier, and you're not gonna have any weird warping in your materials because some of your UV shells are like slanted sideways. So it's important to make sure your shells are either vertical or horizontal, that they're just nice and straight in your UV editor. Now, like I said, when I was done this mesh, I obviously realized it was quite high on polys, and it's not really realistic for an in-game prop. Of course, this is fine for product modeling or just for some nice renders. There's many times in my work where somebody brings me an image just like this vintage adding machine with no dimensions, and they just want me to recreate it for some renders. So this is a way that you could have went about it. Now obviously you need a more optimized mesh for a video game engine or something like that. So I went ahead and just basically duplicated the same mesh over and removed all the bevels. So from a distance, it honestly looks the exact same. It's very hard to tell which one's high poly and which one's low poly. Of course, if you stare really hard, there's definitely things you can pick up, like the harder edges around the curvature. But more or less, it basically looks the exact same. And if we take a closer look at this model, you can see how I only left the bevels on the important edges. So for example, this, since it's a really big bevel, I kept those, but I removed all the other ones. So this is hard edged, and I kept a bevel here. But all these cylinders are just simple cylinders with no bevels, and it really saves you on poly count. So if I open up, if we take a look actually at the poly count, you can see that this one will not include the paper. It's around 227,000 polys or tries, and that's a lot of polys. But this one over here is only sitting at 14,000, and it's much more manageable and it's much more realistic for a game engine. So there's lots of things you can do to save on polys and still make it look realistic. So what you would do is make sure that this is sitting over the position of this high poly, and then you can load in both meshes into Substance Painter. One is your high, one is your low. There's many videos I've done this on my YouTube channel, like the oil cans or the CB radio. So if you're interested in seeing that workflow, there are videos I have. But it's basically the exact same thing. You're just loading two meshes instead of one. And what you would do is texture using the information from this high poly mesh, and then you can just use those materials that you export from Substance and attach them onto your lower poly in-game mesh. And it'll just transfer over all that curvature information, and it will look a little bit more higher poly. So I wanted to quickly go over this because I know a lot of people out there do make models for video games, and you can't always use really dense meshes, but it's pretty surprising actually what you can get away with. I think that one of the biggest differences are honestly not the cutouts in here. So as you can see, this is very dense because I have just edge loops before I smoothed it out to support all those edges. And on this side, it's just a single plane because we can take the information from these booleans And you can simply just like even draw on a black little square around these buttons to make it look like there's actually a hole there. So there's lots of trickery you can do to make it seem like there's some more depth around these keys. But you don't actually have to add those booleans. Of course, it's nice and it's fun to add those booleans, but it's not always needed, and you can save tons of polys. This simple object is 7,500 tries, whereas this one is 2. So pretty big difference. And especially when you have lots of polys in your scene, you can drastically reduce polys by just doing things like that. Along with these, I just wanted to show, I know we went over these cylinders, but this cylinder is beveled and it's smoothed, so it has 950 tries, whereas this one only has 48. It's just a simple cylinder. So by replacing all these tiny cylinders with lesser poly cylinders, you can save on quite a bit. And once again, these 2 meshes will be available on my Patreon page. So if you're interested in taking this, of course it's not UV'd, you can actually UV this one and create your own high and low poly model workflow. Oh yeah, and really quickly, I did mention also at the beginning of the video how there's a few things that I would do differently if I were to redo it. And I definitely cut a few corners or rushed a few things just to save time on this video because I didn't have a lot of time. And one of the main areas, if I isolate this, is this whole area below here. It wasn't in view of the camera, so I really just didn't bother optimizing it or making the topology a lot cleaner. But this is one area because we started off with a cylinder and I made basically a big boolean out of this whole shape. As you can see, the bottom topology is like a bottom of a cylinder. And I could have came through and actually made it more like quads instead of all going to a single point. And honestly, it's not that important because it's not in view, but I feel like I rushed it and it's not a good example of what you should do. So on this lower poly model, when I was trying to reduce things, this is the one area that I would probably go back and just clean up a little bit more rather than going into a single point and make it more into quads and clean this area up. So if you're going to go back and redo this model, this is definitely one area that I just rushed on. And as you can see, I just rather completely avoided it and didn't really spend any time optimizing this area. But I knew it wouldn't be in view. I knew it wasn't important to the model, so I just decided to skip it. But this is the one area that I look back now and I'm like, I should probably mention that to people because if you're following along and you're trying to learn from these videos, this is just not the cleanest topology in the world. Now, to play devil's advocate here, this is honestly not going to affect the model at all. Because it's not being animated, I'm not moving any of these parts, and also because it's underneath the objects, you're not really actually going to see them. You can get away with that and you can cut corners. And I definitely cut some corners when it came to this area. But that's just one thing I wanted to point out to people because technically it's not the cleanest of my work. And it's the one area looking back that I wish I could go back and just redo, or I wish I could have just invested maybe 10, 20 more minutes into it just to end up with a little bit of a cleaner model in the end. But I thought it was important just to make a quick note about that one area. Everything else, as you can see, I tried to keep it in quads. So everything is fairly low in polys. I completely removed the boolean on the bottom here. Since you don't need that depth, you don't need that information, we could just bake that into our lower poly mesh. I just decided to remove that, but I decided to also keep this small cutout here. So it's up to you, depending on how much detail you actually want to throw into your model. And obviously I decided to just remove the bottoms since none of it was going to be in view. This object will never be upside down. I just completely removed the bottom faces of these models. And that's basically how I prepared this vintage adding machine for Substance. So I just simply applied a material to each group, each texture. So then in Substance Painter, under my texture set list, I will see the 2 textures I have applied. And then I can simply start texturing this device. So let's export this thing. Let's jump over to Substance Painter and we can start our texturing. All right, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and load in that FBX file from Maya. So the whole goal with this model was to basically recreate our reference photo. So I wanted to make the textures and the materials very accurate to the image that we were using as our reference. Now luckily, from the website that I found these references images on, there were some really close camera views of the labels. So it was really easy to actually take those images into Photoshop and turn them into alphas just by removing the color from them, basically turning them into a black and white image. That way I can just simply paste those labels directly onto the mesh. And that honestly saved me a ton of time without having to actually recreate my own label. I could just take them from the reference and just paste them on there. Now I know there are a few tiny details that I wish I did a little bit better. So for example, the numbers on the keys, I didn't know exactly what font they were using on the original vintage object from our reference. So I just found something that was very similar, or I thought was similar, and I just went ahead with that. But to be honest with you, if I could go back, I would do a bit more research to try to find out which font those letters were actually being used in. And then I could just basically recreate that exact font just to make it a little bit more accurate to the real life object. But other than that, I basically just took the labels and all of the reference from this specific reference image. Now, of course, it's going to take a bit of messing around with these materials to make it look accurate to the reference photo. So once we fill in those empty meshes with some sort of material, we can start tweaking them and adding fill layers to add a bit more dirt and grunge and slowly build up those layers. I always say it's important to not quickly add on dirt and grunge and just go with one or two different effects. I always find you get better results by slowly building up those details, by adding those dirt and grunge effects very lightly and slowly adding on layers above them. You get a much more realistic result rather than just going with one dirt and grime and just making it very obvious. In most cases, less is more, and I always try to remember that when I'm applying materials. Now there are a few very small details that I decided to add very last minute. For example, that ripped off sticker on the side that you see in the reference photo. I originally decided not to add that in, and then when I came back to the model at the very end, just while editing this video, I thought that's just the one small detail I forgot to add in, or I just chose for some reason not to add in. So last minute, I just took a sticker and I just applied that on, and we will go over that at the very end of this texturing. I'll show you exactly what I did for that specific detail. But other than that, everything else is pretty straightforward. Now, if you're interested in seeing the full texturing process in real time, it will be available on my Patreon page along with the Substance Painter file. So if you're interested in opening that up and seeing how I actually structured these layers, all of that will be available to you on my Patreon page. Now, because I originally wasn't going to create a low and high poly model, we are only going to be using one mesh. We're going to import just a high poly mesh and texture that one. Last minute, I decided to create that lower poly mesh just to show people exactly how I would go about that and what a more optimized mesh would look like. But unfortunately, I did not have any time to UV that one, so we're not going to incorporate that into the texturing workflow. But if that's something that you're interested in getting access to, the lower poly model will be available on my Patreon page as well. Just keep in mind there's no UVs, so you will have to UV it ahead of time. All right, let's slowly add some materials and let's start texturing this vintage adding machine. right, and that is basically everything. The texturing is basically complete. But like I said at the beginning of the video, I decided to add this tiny little sticker that you saw in our reference or something similar to the side of my adding machine. So to do something like this, I just added in a sticker effect. So I have one saved on my computer, and I will actually add the sticker to the folder if you're interested on my Patreon page. But you can also just use Google to find your own as well. But all I did for this was drag it into my scene, and I chose alpha. Let's just create a new layer for it. I believe it's this one right here. So I just added a fill layer. And let's just turn the sticker off so it's blank. And all you can do is right click, turn that into a black mask. Let's go to our sticker. We can double click it to actually select it. Now this sticker is obviously not circular, it's more rectangular. And I've used this actual sticker in many videos for some torn off sticker effects. But all I did for this was just paste it on the side. Right now I'm on erase. Actually go to the paint option, double click our sticker again. Let's enlarge this and let's just paste it on the side. Now of course, I don't want any of the jitter. So let's just drag all of these down. I don't want it to rotate on me. So let's paste that on. And all I did for this was add a tiny bit of height. We want it to look a little bit like some bump was there, like it was sticking up a bit. And then I went in with my eraser tool and I just selected a regular circle brush. And then I just gave it basically erased around it to give it more of a circular effect. And I think I used a hard brush actually just to make the edges a bit more hard. I did something like that. Basically the exact same, I just obviously made it a bit more light. It wasn't so obvious, so you could even like add a bit of transparency if you wanted, just to make it not so obvious. But that's all I did for the sticker effect. I just wanted to add that smaller detail so it's more accurate to our reference. And other than that, everything else is the exact same. So that is everything. That is the whole 3D modeling, UV mapping, and texturing process that I did to create this vintage adding machine. I hope you all enjoyed this video or found it somewhat helpful. Please consider subscribing to the channel or hit that like button. It would really help me out. And as always, I want to give a massive thank you to all of my Patreons. It's really because of all of you that I can continue making these videos, and hopefully as the channel grows, I can continue to dedicate more time to this channel and I can continue making more videos. So to all of my Patreon members, and to all of you subscribers and Discord members and anyone who has helped support this channel along the way, I really can't thank you all enough for your continuous support. Alright, thank you again for tuning into this week's video, and I will catch you all in the next one.